In a great medieval kingdom behind walls of stone and gates of iron, there sat a palace that had stood for centuries and was known throughout the land for its power and its pride. Every morning the palace gates opened and merchants and noblemen and soldiers passed through, and every evening they closed again with the same heavy sound of iron on stone. But there was one figure who was always there before the gates opened and always still there long after they had closed. He was a very old man with white cloudy eyes that could not see, and a long tangled white beard and a torn dirty gray robe that had once perhaps been something finer. He sat hunched against the cold palace wall every single day with a worn wooden bowl in his hands, asking for nothing more than what people chose to give. The merchants ignored him, and the noblemen walked past without looking down, and the guards had grown so used to him that they barely noticed he was there anymore. All except one guard, and that was a young man in silver armor who had only recently been posted to the palace gate and who could not stop wondering about the old blind man. There was something about the way the old man sat that was different from other beggars, something in the stillness of him that felt less like weakness and more like patience. One morning the young guard brought the old man a piece of bread and knelt down beside him, and the old man raised his head slowly and smiled as if he had been expecting exactly this. They began to talk, and what the young guard discovered in those conversations was that the blind old beggar spoke like no beggar he had ever met before. He spoke of the kingdom not as someone looking in from the outside, but as someone who had once known every corridor and every chamber from the inside. He spoke of the king not as a distant figure of power, but as someone he had once known personally, and the young guard felt a chill run through him when he heard this. Days passed, and the young guard found himself returning to the old man again and again, drawn by something he could not quite name or explain. Then one quiet morning the blind old beggar said something that stopped the young guard completely still, as if his feet had been nailed to the stone ground beneath him. The old man reached slowly into the folds of his torn gray robe and withdrew something small and held it out in his wrinkled palm toward the young guard. It was a tiny golden ring so old that its edges had worn smooth, but the engraving on its face was still perfectly clear, and what it showed made the young guard's breath catch in his throat. It was the royal crest, the same crest that flew on every banner above the palace, the same crest that was pressed into every official seal in the kingdom. The young guard stared at the ring for a long time and then looked at the blind old man and then back at the ring and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He closed the old man's fingers gently around the ring, told him not to move, and then turned and ran through the palace gates as fast as his armor would allow. And what happened in the hours that followed would change the kingdom in ways that no one standing at that gate that morning could possibly have imagined. The young guard ran through the stone corridors of the palace, his footsteps echoing off the walls, his heart beating faster than it ever had in battle. He stopped outside the great doors of the throne room and stood there for a long moment, his fist raised to knock, not entirely sure what he was about to set in motion. Then he knocked and the doors opened, and he walked into the throne room and approached the king, who sat alone among his documents and his silence. The young guard opened his hand and held the tiny golden ring out before the king and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The king leaned forward and looked at the ring, and something happened to his face that the young guard had never seen happen to a king before. The color left his face completely and his eyes went very still, and for a long moment the most powerful man in the kingdom looked like a very small and frightened boy. He reached out and took the ring from the guard's palm with hands that were not entirely steady and turned it slowly in the torchlight. Then he stood up from his throne so quickly that the guard stepped back and grabbed the young man by the shoulders and asked him where he had found this. The guard pointed toward the palace gate, and the king did not wait for another word but strode out of the throne room at a pace that made his cape sweep out behind him. The young guard ran to keep up as the king moved through the palace corridors faster than anyone had seen him move in years. They emerged from the palace doors into the open air, and the king stopped so suddenly that the guard nearly walked into him. There at the base of the palace wall, in the same spot he occupied every single day, sat the blind old beggar, completely still and completely unaware of who now stood before him. The king walked toward the old man slowly this time, each step slower than the last, as if the ground between them was growing heavier with every inch. He crouched down before the blind old man, and for a long time he simply looked at the weathered face, the clouded eyes, the tangled white beard. Then the blind old beggar turned his face toward the king without being told anyone was there, and smiled a smile that was full of things the king could not yet understand. He spoke the king's name quietly and without hesitation, and the king felt something inside his chest collapse like a wall that had been standing for too long. He asked the old man how he knew who stood before him, and the old man said, I have known the sound of your footsteps since you were young enough to run through these very corridors." The king sat down on the cold stone ground beside the blind old beggar and did not care about his crown or his robe or what anyone watching might think. And the old man began to speak, and what he said carried the weight of decades of silence finally being broken in the only place it could have ever truly mattered. He told the king about the day he had been sent away, about the long years that had followed, and about why he had come back and chosen to sit outside these walls every single day. The king listened without moving, without speaking, without looking away, his hands clasped together on his knees, and his eyes fixed on the old man's calm and weathered face. The old man told him that he had not come back out of bitterness, and he had not come back seeking revenge, and he had not come back to shame the man who had sent him away. He said he had come back because a kingdom is only as strong as the wisdom it chooses to keep close, and he had unfinished wisdom left to give. The king covered his face with one hand and sat in silence for a long moment as the full weight of those words settled over him like a heavy stone. Then the blind old beggar reached out and gently removed the king's hand from his face and held it in both of his own wrinkled hands and said, "It is not too late." Those 5 words hit the king harder than any sword ever had, and he felt something break open inside him that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He asked the old man why he had never announced himself, why he had sat in rags against the wall day after day without ever saying who he was. And the old man said, "Because I needed to know if the king I once served had become a man worth serving again, and I could only learn that by watching, not by asking." The king stood slowly and extended both hands to the blind old beggar and lifted him carefully to his feet as if he were handling something irreplaceable. He removed his own heavy outer robe and placed it around the old man's thin shoulders, and the old man accepted it without protest and without pride. They walked together toward the palace doors, the king moving slowly to match the old man's pace, the young guard following a respectful distance behind. The guards at the gate stood frozen, watching their king walk side by side with the man they had ignored and stepped around every single day for months. Inside the palace, the king led the blind old man through the grand corridors, and servants pressed themselves against the walls, watching in stunned silence. The king opened the doors to a warm chamber with a fireplace and a comfortable chair and food on the table, and said, "This is yours for as long as you wish to stay." The blind old beggar ran his fingers along the doorframe and the walls and the chair, and sat down slowly and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his clouded eyes toward the king and said, "You have changed," and the king replied, "I had a great deal of help from a man sitting outside my own gate." They sat together by the fire that evening and talked through the night as the flames burned low and the candles melted down to nothing. And the young guard who had started all of it stood outside the closed chamber door in the corridor and smiled quietly to himself, knowing that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply notice who others have chosen not to see. In the days that followed, the king ruled differently, more carefully, more humbly, with a new voice beside him that had once been cast out into the cold. And the spot beside the palace gate where the blind old beggar had sat every day was empty now, but everyone who passed it from that day forward looked at it differently because they had learned that wisdom does not always arrive wearing a crown. Sometimes it arrives in a torn gray robe with a wooden bowl and eyes that cannot see but somehow see everything.